And right now we've got somebody very fun joining us today who also had very strong stories about certain things. It was so much fun untangling some of them. Nadine, did you want to introduce her?
Yes, a fellow journalist, so great at stories. I welcome Jessica Robinson. Jessica is a phenomenal creative person who works at the Globe and Mail and had published a book of poetry this year. And Jess, I'm going to ask you like 3 sentences, like tops of the waves. How would you describe where you were when you started Kickstartology and where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like you guys picked a really good day to bring me on because everything that Stephanie's talking about, I go, oh, I remember that. I remember that. When I started, I really felt as though goals should be things you knew how to achieve, that you could write out the plan for, you could see exactly how you were going to pull it off. But as a result, of course, it meant that they weren't exciting. I wasn't terribly motivated to go for them. And that applied to whether it was like what I saw as the next job at work, what was going to be next for me in my poetry career, which at the time I wasn't even characterizing as a career. It was, a side project because that was a story I was telling myself. And I wasn't necessarily thinking about how I wanted to live holistically either. I was looking at things in a really siloed way. My career independent to my poetry, to where I lived, who I lived with, et cetera. Through coaching, I learned how to think a lot bigger and plan a little bit, but make sure that my goals pushed me into a place where I couldn't plan entirely. And it's pushed my progress and my achievement and my growth way beyond where I would have been if I'd stuck to all of those little itty bitty goals that I wasn't even excited about.
I love that. And you did have like a very audacious dream. The poetry was part of it, but like you had a bigger dream and you're about to set off to do it. I want you to talk about that because I think so many of us, especially like you're someone in your 20s, in our 20s, sometimes we feel like I got to do this and then I got to do this and tick off this box and tick off this box. And sometimes we don't give ourselves space to take the big, bold choice. So speak to that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, definitely. When I got on my initial call with Stephanie to talk about what I potentially wanted to get out of coaching and Kickstartology, we started by talking about the career stuff. And pretty quickly, we realized that I was pretty happy with where I was career-wise. I was already at the Globe. I was already full-time at that point. And so focusing there didn't make a lot of sense because I knew it was next and that was fine. But when we talked about how I wanted to live, I said, well, the big dream, way down the line, so far out from now, is for me to live a little bit more of that nomadic lifestyle, travel to different places, work remotely, and see more of the world. And I'd really love to start with the East Coast one day. And Stephanie was like, well, what if, it wasn't one day? What if you picked a date? And so I said, yeah, I guess there's not really any reason why I couldn't do it in the next year. And then we tightened up that timeline a little bit to make it, June 2022. And she asked,
just for perspective, that wasn't all on the first call at this point.
No,
but...
no, yeah, it was a really effective, 20-minute session, not quite. And as we started to figure out what it looked like, what I wanted, we started to think about, okay, well, you want to pick up and move to the East Coast. How long do you want to be out there for? And my answer was 2 months. And Stephanie goes, okay, why 2 months? And I said, well, that's how long I know my employer will allow me to work remotely for. And she goes, okay, right away, you should be asking for 3 months. Right away, you're already making your goal informed by someone else's rules that you're
Sorry, can I just pause again?
Please.
I love revisionist history, but and it's so funny because this happens all the time. But actually, what I asked you is, how long do you really want to go for?
Yeah.
And you said 3 months. And I said, oh, why not make that your goal? And you're like, but I can't. I'm like, why not see what happens? Right. So I wasn't actually being bossy and saying.
Very fair.
I love the memory though. It's hilarious.
But I think that's a good point to just like quickly touch on, because as women often like we're so, it's those people pleasing tendencies that tend to, we see a lot in our client. And the worst someone is going to say is no. And then you're back to 2 months, which was already your expectation. But taking that risk to ask for a little bit more, we see it in salary negotiations. We see it in relationship discussions. Like, it comes up in so many areas. So that's a really good point.
And that was a huge thing. It took me months to work through it. And that was something I focused hugely on in that time, was like, I was so scared that they were going to say no when I asked for the 3 months, because I knew they would say yes to 2, and 3, I didn't know. I didn't know 100%. And when and correct me if I'm revising it, but what I remember is you saying, what do you think is going to happen if you ask for 3 months? Like, what's the worst case? And I was like, they'll fire me. And you were like, what do you mean?
Yeah, they love
What's
you.
the likelihood of that? And saying it out loud, then of course I could hear that, you know, it was pretty unlikely that they would let me go just for asking for something. But I really believed it until I was pushed to actually engage with it in that moment. Now, what's really exciting is that I'm a month tomorrow, I set off on the road trip and I'm moving out there for 3 months, which is really cool. I've already let go of my apartment. I'm coming to you from my parents' place in the suburbs right now, but as we're in between leases. But we're doing it. We're moving to Halifax, where we've never set foot. And it's going to be this really cool adventure that I was picturing for some reason being, 3, 4, 5 years down the line when I was ready, and ignoring the fact that I could choose to be ready. I just had to make that decision and follow through on it for myself.
Yeah, that's huge.
I love that. And then the other thing I just wanted to touch on with that was, when you decided that you were going to ask for 3 months, it also changed some of the things you did at work, because you were like, I'm going to set up to make that happen. And you also kind of checked out your options outside of work. You set up the way you did a few things at work so that you felt as confident as possible, even though it was scary, asking. So often when we aim higher than what we think is possible, right, which isn't to go into fantasy land delusion, right, because that then works against us. But when we're like, maybe that, you know how I said it's like a good crush, it gives you butterflies and feels like kind of possible, maybe out of reach, but kind of could happen. We're more likely to do the work to make something happen that's beyond our expectations. So I remember you just really lining up your ducks, we like to align our squirrels in Kickstartology, lining up ducks. What's the point, really? So.
Yeah, it was very much that.
I was just going to say, we have only a few minutes left, but what advice do you have for people just starting out with this kind of work, or starting to explore these kinds of possibilities for themselves?
Yeah, what's the next level past the goal you're currently looking at, to me is really helpful if you're on that side where you're the project manager, lawyer, planner side of things, which is definitely where I sit and where I can speak to the most. You might think it's a really audacious goal, but if you go a step beyond that, that's when you're actually making that audacious dream and plan. And the get curious piece of advice or tool even that Kickstartology offers is what has definitely changed things for me. I used to so shut down with anxiety or fear when I looked at something that I didn't know how to do, but getting that as an opportunity, like almost like an internal signal to get curious about, well, why am I anxious? What is it that's making me anxious? What would happen? Spelling that out made it so that I was able to make more informed decisions based on the information that was actually available to me, instead of what my reaction was to the information. And that differentiation is really key through the curiosity part of things.
Yeah, that's great. Touch on last thing, the group. Like, I think a lot of people wonder, one-on-one coaching versus group coaching. What was the benefit to you of choosing this path?
Oh, group coaching is definitely it for me. Because you get to meet a bunch of really cool women, and the connections are awesome. And I leverage them constantly, and people leverage me, and it's great. I think what really helped in terms of the further growth part of it is that you're not just learning by the questions that you come up with. People ask questions that apply to you all the time, but you would never think of framing in that way, or you'd forget about, you've got a lot of stuff going on. So you're constantly learning, not just from your own experiences, but other people's as well. And it's just exponentially increasing your opportunity to learn, essentially.
Yeah, I love that. Steph, do you have a final question?
I don't. I think you're awesome.
Oh,
Yeah, we
thanks.
think you're awesome.
I think you
I
guys
mean,
are
I'm
awesome too.
especially biased, but
Oh, the other thing, I feel like I've got like 1 minute. The other thing I'll mention
Go for it.
is that you'll end up doing things that don't necessarily feel like goals, not something that you would plan and build towards, but that become the tool or the habit or the autopilot that informs your future goals. And what I'm thinking about when I say that is that through coaching and through encouragement and support and pushing into scary zones, I went from not identifying myself as a full-time poet, so to speak. I used to make a joke that I was a poet on evenings and weekends outside of my 9 to 5 to actually doing things like taking my typewriter to a park and doing those like pay for poetry live executions where I really put myself out there, and I was so scared that I was not going to have any interest. And I just typed poems for strangers on the street. And that was part of not just my actual concrete goals for my life, but creating that habit of identifying anxiety or fear, pushing through it, and growing as a result. So your growth is not limited to just the STAR goal or whatever it is that you put down on paper.
I'd forgotten about that. I remember that. That was so funny. I think that came out of a conversation we had where I said my challenge to you was do something scary.
Yeah, I think it was do something where you're probably going to experience failure, because I was so good at creating environments or situations where I couldn't fail. And I really needed to fail at something. And sometimes I did. You know, there were a lot of people that walked by me while sitting at my typewriter who had no interest in what I was doing. And I chalked all those up to failures. But every time someone did stop, I won a little bit too.
I love it. It's so great. Thank you so much
That's
for
so great.
giving us your time and sharing your stories with everyone today, Jess.
Thanks for having me.